Hugo Cabret, Part 2, Chapter 10. A train arrives at the station. "What should we do with him?" asked Monsieur Frick. "Follow me," said the station inspector, who led them back to his office. He opened the metal cell in the corner, and they threw Hugo inside. Then he quickly locked the cage, which Hugo had always feared so much, and he tucked the key back into his pocket. The station inspector turned to Madame Emile and Monsieur Frick. "I promise you both he won't escape this time. I'll call the police, and you'll never be bothered by this slippery rat again." The station inspector smiled when he said this, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was a mean and dangerous smile. Madame Emile and Monsieur Frick bid farewell to the station inspector, leaving him alone with Hugo. The station inspector called the police station, then said to Hugo, "Are you sure you don't want to confess now? No? Well then, I'll be back with a few of my friends. Don't go anywhere while I'm away." Ha 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 ha! The inspector station laughed as he left the office and closed the door behind him. Hugo sat there like an animal, wet and shivering in the corner of his cage. He wished Isabelle were here with him with one of her bobby pins. Hugo was left by himself for a long time. He was going to be put in prison now, or an orphanage. He was sure of it. The mechanical man would be thrown away. He would never see Isabelle or her godparents again. He covered his eyes with his hands. Finally, the door to the office opened, and in came the station inspector with 2 policemen. Hugo stood up and tried to back himself farther into the corner of the tiny cage. "He won't talk?" said one of the policemen. "Nothing," said the station inspector. "Well, maybe a ride to the police station will help you a little." "Come on, boy, your limousine is waiting." The station inspector opened the cage, and Hugo saw his opportunity. Once again, he made a dash for it. He slipped between the police officers and he ran back into the station. It was crowded today, and Hugo was bounced from person to person as he shuffled through the station. By the time he came into a clearing, he had lost his sense of direction. He turned and saw the station inspector coming closer, with the 2 policemen right behind him. Hugo thought he saw Madame Emile and Monsieur Frick closing in quickly too. He kept running and was knocked over by some travelers rushing to catch their train. He landed on his hand and screamed in pain. He managed to get back up, and then, with tears blurring his vision and desperately trying to reach the front doors of the station, he stumbled and ran in exactly the wrong direction. He tripped and fell several feet down onto the tracks. He looked up into the face of a train barreling into the station. From somewhere behind him he thought he heard a scream. The horrible sound of the brakes being pulled, coupled with the metallic screech of the wheels against the rails, made it seem like the whole station was about to collapse around him. The black train was zooming right toward Hugo, and he was caught, unable to look away, as though he were watching a movie. At the last possible moment, Hugo was yanked up off the tracks to safety. Smoke billowed out of the slowing engine as a shower of sparks flew from every wheel. Hugo felt dizzy. There were a few moments of dazed silence. Then steam was released from somewhere, and it made a sound like the train was sighing. for everyone on the train, nothing extraordinary had happened. They had simply pulled into the station. But for Hugo, the entire world was ending. Again, the station inspector was holding his arm, his injured hand throbbing in pain. He could see the policemen removing handcuffs from their belts, and finally the pain and the terror grew too much. When Hugo opened his eyes, all he could see were stars. Stars and moons and what looked like a rocket ship. It was the cape from a trip to the moon, and Georges Millier was wearing it. "Ah, welcome back, Hugo Cabret," he said, holding the boy's head in his lap on a bench in the station inspector's office. Standing behind Hugo was Isabelle, leaning on her crutches. "Drink this," she said as she handed him a cup of water. "I knew something was wrong," she continued. "It was taking you too much time to come back home. Papa Georges insisted on coming with me." The station inspector reached forward for Hugo, but the old man said in his most dramatic voice, "Take your hands off him." "I'm sorry, sir, but as I was saying earlier, this boy was caught stealing from the cafe and from the timekeeper, who has disappeared mysteriously. We believe he might be involved." Hugo saw that Madame Emile and Monsieur Frick had made their way into the office and were listening to everything. "Tell him what you know, Hugo," said Hugo Millier. Hugo gazed up into his eyes, which looked more gentle and welcoming than he ever had seen before. He whispered, "It's fine, Hugo. You're coming home with us. Now tell the station inspector what you know." Hugo looked up at the station inspector. "The timekeeper was my uncle, and I was his apprentice. But he drank, and he disappeared a while back, and I had to steal milk and croissants because I was hungry, and I've been taking care of the clocks ever since. And now he's dead, and it'll be in the papers tomorrow." The station inspector studied Hugo, his eyebrows scowling. After what seemed like an eternity, he unexpectedly started to laugh. The two policemen standing behind him looked confused. "You?" said the station inspector. "You've been keeping the clocks running in the entire station? By yourself? A boy of 10? Ha! I'm 12, said Hugo. The station inspector continued to laugh. "Well, old man, your little friend has quite a good imagination. Don't you think we would know if the timekeeper was dead?" "He is dead," said Madame Emile. "The boy is telling the truth." "I'll vouch for that," said Monsieur Frick. "But what was that thing you were stealing in the timekeeper's apartment?" "I wasn't stealing it," said Hugo, who looked up at the old man and said, "I dropped it. It's broken again." "I'm not worried about that. I think between the two of us, we can have it fixed up pretty quickly." Georges Millier turned to the station inspector. "You can't steal something that you already own now, can you? That machine is his. We'll figure out how to repay you, madame, for the milk and the croissants. But now I think it's time for us to get out of this station." He helped Hugo stand. The children were enveloped by the soft folds of the old man's cape, and together they all headed home. And that is the end of this section. Next time we'll find out what happens